For nearly 2 decades before the Second World War, Singapore stood as the symbol of British power in Asia. To politicians in London, to colonial administrators, and to much of the world, the island fortress was considered unbreakable. It was called the Gibraltar of the East, a strategic stronghold meant to safeguard the British Empire's interests across the Far East. Enormous sums of money were spent to fortify it. Massive naval bases were carved into the coastline. Huge coastal guns were installed, capable of firing shells weighing nearly a ton. British leaders believed that if war ever came to Asia, the Royal Navy would steam to Singapore and crush any enemy fleet that dared approach. What they did not foresee was that the fortress would fall not to battleships, but to soldiers advancing through jungle, mud, and rain. In the Second World War, began in Europe in 1939, Singapore remained far from the front lines. Yet the threat from Japan was growing. Japan had already demonstrated its military ambitions in China, occupying vast territories after years of brutal fighting. Still, British planners underestimated Japan's capabilities. Racist assumptions clouded strategic thinking. Many British officers believed Japanese soldiers were physically inferior and lacked the discipline to fight a modern war against European forces. These beliefs would prove disastrously wrong. By 1941, Britain's military position in Southeast Asia was dangerously weak. Most of its best troops and equipment were tied down fighting Germany and Italy in Europe and North Africa. Singapore's defenses existed largely on paper. While the coastal guns were formidable, they were designed to repel naval attacks, not land invasions. The interior of the island was poorly fortified. Airfields were few, aircraft were outdated, and trained pilots were scarce. Tanks, which would later prove decisive in jungle fighting, were virtually non-existent in Malaya. Command of British forces in Malaya and Singapore fell to Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a quiet, intellectual officer known more for his staff work than for battlefield command. Percival was cautious by nature and deeply concerned about overstretching his forces. Under him served a diverse army: British regulars, Indian divisions, Australian units, and local volunteers. Many of these soldiers had never fought together before. Training standards varied widely. Jungle warfare training was minimal. Coordination between units was often poor. On the Japanese side stood General Tomoyuki Yamashita, an aggressive and highly intelligent commander. Yamashita understood his own weaknesses. His forces were numerically inferior to the British, and Japanese logistics were stretched thin. He did not have the supplies for a long campaign. But Yamashita believed in speed, audacity, and psychological shock. His plan was simple: strike fast, strike hard, and never allow the British time to organize a coherent defense. The storm broke on December 7, 1941. While Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops simultaneously landed across Southeast Asia. In the early hours of December 8th, Japanese forces came ashore in northern Malaya and southern Thailand. The invasion had begun. Japanese airfields were bombed almost immediately. On the ground, outdated British aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. Within days, Japan achieved air superiority. The skies over Malaya belonged to the Japanese. This alone doomed much of the British defense. Without air cover, ground forces were vulnerable to constant bombing and strafing. Japanese infantry advanced southward with shocking speed. Riding bicycles along narrow roads, they bypassed strong points and appeared suddenly behind British lines. Where resistance stiffened, Japanese troops infiltrated through jungle paths thought impassable. British units trained to fight set-piece battles in open terrain found themselves outmaneuvered and outflanked repeatedly. At Jitra, one of the first major defensive positions, British and Indian troops attempted to hold their ground, but confusion reigned. Orders were unclear. Communication broke down. When Japanese forces threatened to encircle the position, Percival authorized a withdrawal. The retreat quickly turned chaotic. Equipment was abandoned. Morale suffered a heavy blow. The pattern repeated itself again and again. At Slim River in January 1942, Japanese tanks launched a daring night attack. British commanders had believed tanks could not operate effectively in jungle terrain. They were wrong. Japanese armor smashed through Indian positions, using headlights and machine guns to devastating effect. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed or captured. The road south lay open. Australian units fought fiercely, particularly at Gemas and Moore. In several engagements, they inflicted serious casualties on Japanese troops. Yet bravery could not compensate for strategic failure. Japanese pressure never relented. Yamashita drove his men forward relentlessly, often ignoring his own supply shortages. He knew that hesitation would give the British time to regroup. As the Japanese advanced, the civilian population suffered terribly. Bombs fell on towns and villages. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing south toward Singapore. Families carried what little they could, abandoning homes and livelihoods. Fear spread with every mile the Japanese advanced. Rumors of massacres and atrocities traveled faster than the armies themselves. By late January 1942, British forces were retreating toward the Johor Strait, the narrow body of water separating Malaya from Singapore Island. Engineers prepared to destroy the causeway behind them. On January 31st, the last British troops crossed into Singapore, and the causeway was blown apart. To many, this felt like a final stand. The fortress would now prove its worth. But the reality was grim. Singapore was overcrowded with soldiers and civilians. Supplies were limited. The island's water supply depended largely on reservoirs and pipelines from the mainland, now under Japanese control. Japanese artillery began shelling the island almost immediately. Bombers struck airfields, docks, and civilian areas. Fires burned across the city. Hospitals filled with wounded. The famed coastal guns, symbols of British power, were largely useless. Most were aimed south toward the sea. Some could be turned inland, but they lacked suitable ammunition. Armor-piercing shells passed straight through jungle and buildings, causing little damage to infantry. Defensive positions along the northern coast were incomplete and thinly held. On the night of February 8, 1942, Yamashita launched his assault on Singapore Island. Under cover of darkness, Japanese troops crossed the Johor Strait in small boats. Despite heavy fire from Australian defenders, they gained a foothold on the northwest coast. Once ashore, they moved swiftly inland. British counterattacks were poorly coordinated and failed to dislodge them. Yamashita intensified the pressure. He attacked at multiple points, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. In truth, his troops were exhausted and dangerously low on ammunition. Some Japanese units had only a few days of supplies left. Yamashita was gambling everything on psychological collapse. Inside Singapore, conditions worsened rapidly. Japanese artillery fire intensified. Civilian neighborhoods were hit repeatedly. Thousands sought shelter in basements, tunnels, and sewers. Water shortages became critical. Disease spread. Food supplies dwindled. Fear and despair hung over the city.
British command struggled to respond effectively. Orders were contradictory. Units were shifted back and forth without clear purpose. Key positions were abandoned prematurely. The vital Bukit Timah area, containing fuel and supply depots, fell to the Japanese on February 11th. The loss was catastrophic. Japanese forces captured vast quantities of British fuel and ammunition, easing their own shortages. Winston Churchill, watching events unfold from London, was horrified. He sent messages urging resistance to the last man. He believed Singapore must be held at all costs, for its fall would shake the empire. But Churchill was far away. On the ground, Percival faced a nightmare. His troops were exhausted, his defenses collapsing, and his civilian population on the brink of catastrophe. By February 14th, Japanese forces were within artillery range of the city center. The water supply was close to failure, ammunition stocks were dangerously low, hospitals overflowed, civilian casualties mounted by the hour. Percival convened his senior commanders. The question was no longer whether Singapore could be held, but how many would die if the fighting continued. On February 15, 1942, Percival made his decision. Continuing the fight, he believed, would lead to slaughter without altering the outcome. That afternoon, under a white flag, he went to meet General Yamashita at the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah. The meeting was tense. Yamashita demanded unconditional surrender. Percival attempted to negotiate, but Yamashita refused. He knew his own army was near exhaustion, yet he projected absolute confidence. At 6:10 p.m., Percival signed the surrender document. Singapore had fallen. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. Over 80,000 Allied soldiers were taken prisoner. It was the largest surrender in British military history. The myth of British invincibility in Asia was shattered in a single stroke. For the prisoners of war, the suffering was only beginning. They were marched into captivity, crammed into camps, and subjected to brutal treatment. Thousands would die from starvation, disease, and forced labor. Many were sent to build the Burma-Kailand Railway, a project that became synonymous with human suffering. For civilians, Japanese occupation brought fear and repression. The Suk-Ching massacres targeted ethnic Chinese civilians, with thousands executed. Daily life became a struggle for survival. Food was scarce, forced labor was common, fear was constant. The fall of Singapore reverberated across the world. In Asia, it inspired nationalist movements and undermined European colonial authority. If Britain could be defeated, so could other empires. For Japan, it marked the height of its power. For Britain, it was a humiliation that would haunt its leaders for decades. Winston Churchill later described Singapore as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Arthur Percival would carry the weight of the defeat for the rest of his life. General Yamashita, despite his victory, would be executed after the war, held responsible for crimes committed under his command. The fall of Singapore was not inevitable, but it was the result of years of complacency, underestimation, and strategic blindness. It stands as a warning written in blood and fire, a reminder that fortresses are only as strong as the assumptions behind them, and that empires can fall, not slowly, but suddenly, when arrogance meets reality.